But this morning, we actually have reached a pivotal point in our series called the Jesus-Centered Church, where we're finally going to turn a corner to talk about what does it actually mean to be a Jesus-centered church. We actually spent the last month just defining the word church, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For some people, you hear that word and you think, okay, it's a building or a service. It's some kind of kids ministry or student ministry programming. There's a pastor and a band. But what we saw is that's not really the way the Bible uses that word. In fact, kind of the working definition that we are going off of is that church is a gathering of God's people for worship, community, and mission. So whenever God's people are gathered together for worship, community, and mission, whether that's out in the city somewhere or in somebody's living room, around a dinner table or in a park, that is the church. And we actually spent the last 3 weeks doing a deep dive into worship, community, and last week was mission. And if you remember, last week, as you left, you got these blessing cards. And so on one side, it says bless 5. There's 5 lines for you to be able to write the names of 5 people that you want to be intentional to bless. And on the other side is what our acronym BLESS stands for. So it talks about beginning with prayer, listening, eating with people, serving them, sharing God's story with them. So it's a little cheat sheet. And I had coffee this week with somebody who said that he felt like God had put the name of one of his neighbors on his heart to add to his list. And so he wrote the name down, but he didn't really know too much about his neighbor. So he just started with the first thing on the card. He just began by praying for him, praying blessing, and just asking that he would get an opportunity to learn more about who this guy is. And lo and behold, later in the week, he and some neighborhood friends got together for a fantasy football draft, and his neighbor showed up. And this guy I was having coffee with said he didn't even have to bring anything up, that just the course of conversation turned to spiritual matters. And so in the course of that conversation, he got to learn where this guy's at spiritually, some of his journey, where his spouse is, and they've even made plans to get together to hang out and have a meal and all that stuff. So all that to say, number one, listen, if you do the blessed rhythms, I promise if you begin with prayer, the listen, eating, serve, all that stuff just naturally flows from that. But the other thing that I hope you realize is I didn't just give you those cards so you could walk out of here and say, oh, that was a nice little sermon, throw it in the back of your back seat and never think about it again. What we want to do is we want to build a lifestyle of blessing the people around us. Because if it becomes our lifestyle, what's going to happen is those communities of worship, community, and mission just naturally pop up. The way people phrase it is, if you plant the gospel, a church will form. Now, those people may never walk inside of this building, but it will become a church. And so the question is then, how do we make sure that that church centers on Jesus? So for the next couple of weeks, we're going to flesh out what does it mean to actually be a church with Jesus at the center. So today is really part 1 of part 2. I've got to establish some terminology to kind of set up. So really all of today is just set up for what we're going to start next week. But everything we talk about is so important because I'm going to be referencing some terms that were coined by a guy named Paul Hebert. Now, Paul Hebert was a missiologist and an anthropologist, which means he studied mission movements, people, and how people groups are established. And what he discovered is there's 2 primary ways that groups form their identity. And so I want to talk about these, but I don't just want to talk about them. Listen, every week people are like, Matt, can you draw more pictures? Can you bring the whiteboard out again? It's so much fun. I've heard the cries. So yes, we have brought the whiteboard back out. But really for me, this is actually just helpful for me. I'm a visual learner. I don't know if I ever graduated past the picture book phase or not, but for me, it helps to see things. And so what Paul Hebert suggests is that the first way that people form a group identity is based on the lines or the boundaries that they end up drawing. Now, whenever we talk about boundaries, yes, boundaries are helpful. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But he says that this first way of forming a group identity is what he calls bounded set, or what sometimes I call closed set, just because bounded makes it seem like boundaries are bad, and they're not. So here's our picture. All these little dots represent people. And so how do we determine who is in a group and who is not in a group? Well, bounded or closed set thinking would be, all right, we're going to draw some lines here, and the people who are inside the line are in, the people who are outside the line are out. Now, what is the line? Well, specifically for churches, one of the lines might be doctrine. Now, of course, there are certain non-negotiable things that it takes to be an Orthodox follower of Jesus. These would be the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. We're going to flesh this out next week. So just give me a little bit of leash here to establish what we're talking about. But for some churches, it might be like, okay, we subscribe to the 5 points of Calvinism. And so if you agree with that, you're in. If you don't, you're out. Or we believe in infant baptism. And so if you agree with that, you're in. And if not, you're out. Or we believe like women should be in all positions of leadership. If you agree with that, you're in. And if you don't, you're out. So clear, defined lines, who is a part of the group and who is not. But increasingly over the last maybe 10 years or so, it's not just doctrine, sometimes even politics becomes a line that church communities can draw. Because as our world gets more polarized, some people say, well, I just want to be a part of a community where people vote and think just like me. So you'll see people say, well, you can't be a Christian and vote Democrat. You can't be a Christian and vote Republican. And so that would be a line that people draw. Sometimes you can even draw a line around morality, right? Like, okay, if you drink alcohol, you are out, and if you don't, you are in. If you listen to non-Christian music, you're out. If you listen to Christian music, you're in. And so we can start to draw all sorts of lines. Now, is line drawing inherently bad? No, there are actually some good things when we draw lines. For example, line drawing promotes huge clarity on who is in and who is out. It helps you know, like, this is our identity. This is what we are all about. So an example maybe of a non-church, example of this would be my kids play basketball, and they have played on AAU travel teams before. So when you play on a travel team, does everybody get to be on the team? No. Okay, maybe you don't know sports. They don't. You got to try out, then you got to pay money, and then you got to pay to watch your kids, and then they got to attend the practices. Not anybody can be on a travel team. Like, it is a very clear set of who is in and who is out. Now, when it comes to church, one of the drawbacks of a bounded set is that it can create a type of judgmentalism in people, where an elitism comes in where we say, okay, we're in, so we're good, and the people who are out, well, they are bad. At least an example of how this happens in my life. Like, growing up, I just assumed if you love Jesus, you were at church on Sunday morning. So I don't know if this ever happened to you. Maybe it happened today. You get in the car, you're driving to church, and you see somebody out for a morning run, or they're walking their dog, or they're sitting on the front porch enjoying their morning cup of coffee. And in the back of my head, I would think, whew, they are not Christians. They are not following Jesus because they are not at church, right? Like, I had a clear line, and that line led me to judge other people. It also kind of develops into a legalistic mentality because the focus tends to be on getting these people to adhere to the line so they can get in, and making sure everybody else abides by the line so that they don't leave. Does this make sense? All right, if not, feel free to text in a question. We'll do Q&A at the end. All right, so if you grew up maybe in a bounded set, closed set type of thinking, we look at this and they say, okay, maybe this isn't the best way. So we say, well, the problem is the line. So what do? We erase the line, and we do what Hybert calls fuzzy set groups. So here, there are still some kind of boundaries, but it's not exactly clear what they are or how we abide by them. And so listen, a good thing about this is that it is highly inclusive, because anybody can be a part of the group, right? There's really not that many boundaries, low barrier of entry. The downside of this is there's a lack of accountability because nobody knows what we're supposed to do. So if a church becomes fuzzy set, what's the difference between church and the PTA or the Kiwanis Club or any other kind of civic engagement group, right? There's no boundaries. Now, an example of fuzzy set, a couple of weeks ago, I had the honor and privilege of attending summer camp with our student ministry. And so I know many of you prayed for me, and I needed every last one of those prayers. Now, if you've ever been to a summer camp, there's this crazy thing that happens. I was at a college campus, so they have like a gymnasium. So you go in, and there are some people, and they're playing basketball. And on the same court, there are some people playing volleyball. And some people are playing pickleball. Some people are playing dodgeball. And some people are wandering around aimlessly and have no idea what they're doing. So at any given moment, you're playing basketball, and you look to the person next to you, and you don't know, are they on my team playing basketball, or did they come over to pick up a pickleball, right? Like, it's just mass chaos. You don't know what's going on. That is the epitome of fuzzy set type of thinking. So here's what fuzzy set and bounded set have in common. The whole focus is on the line drawing. And not only does fuzzy set lead to a lack of accountability, you know what it inevitably leads to? Bounded set thinking. So here's what I mean. You're like, that person's judgmental. As soon as we say somebody, you're a line drawer, you're judgmental, what have we just done? We've drawn a line around them, and we have labeled them as bad. So for example, let's just say somebody draws a line and says, you can't be a Christian and watch secular TV shows. And you're like, well, I don't agree with that, so I'm going to come right over here, and I'm going to use that same line to judge you. It's all about the line. Who is in and who is out? Now, did Jesus encounter bounded set and fuzzy set type of thinking in his ministry? Absolutely, he did. In fact, there were people who were bounded set, and not only were they bounded set, they were proud of it. These are the people called the Pharisees. Now, if you read the gospel accounts, sometimes the Pharisees get a bad rap, and deservedly so. But remember, the Pharisees were not bad people. They actually loved God. They wanted to see him restore his kingdom. But when they looked at it, especially in Jesus' day, they looked at first century Jewish people living under Roman occupation, and they really wanted God to show up and liberate his people. Because as they looked back at Israel's history, they knew that God established Israel to be a light to the world, to show the world what it looks like when heaven comes to earth. That's why God told Israel, I don't want you to have a king for yourself. I want you to let me lead you. I don't want you to have a massive military. Let me protect you. Don't store up a ton of wealth. Let me provide for you. It's why he says treat other people like love them, don't murder them, don't steal from them, all of that stuff. He's creating heaven on earth. But over the years, what happens to Israel? Israel says, I want a king. We want to rule ourselves. We don't want you to rule us. We want to have a massive standing military so we can protect ourselves. We want to store up a ton of wealth so that we can provide for ourselves. They start to worship other gods. And so in the Old Testament, we see this slow descent, this move away from God to the point where he says, listen, I'm not going to force this on you. He removes his protection, and Israel's enemies come in and conquer them. So the Pharisees in Jesus' day say, we did not keep the commands, and so our enemies conquered us and we live under subjugation. So if we're living under oppression because we did not keep the commands, how will we get liberation? By the audience participation here, by keeping the commands. So they really believed if they could just get all the Jewish people to observe one Sabbath, that God would restore Israel back to their position of prominence and power. So they become like the moral police. But they are like so zealous in their efforts that they practice something called fencing the law, where they make extra commands to make sure that nobody breaks God's actual commands. So here's how this works. For example, let's say in the Torah it said no one touches Matt's table. All right, that is against God's command. It is against Matt's commands also. Do not touch my table. So what the Pharisees would say is, okay, in order not to do that, no one can get within 6 feet of the table. And the Pharisees said if you got within 6 feet, then that is equal to breaking the command. Breaking the Pharisees' commands, they viewed as breaking God's commands, which is why they get so mad at Jesus. Because Jesus respects the commands of Torah, but he does not respect the fences they've erected around those commands. Right? So there's a story in Mark where it's the Sabbath day. Are you supposed to work on the Sabbath? Yes or no? No. What does Jesus do? Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, which the Pharisees said you can't heal someone because that might get you too close to actually working on the Sabbath. So they're constantly coming into conflict. That's why they get frustrated when Jesus is eating with people like tax collectors and prostitutes. Because now, Jesus, there are people who are outside of the boundary, and you're like approving of them being outside the boundary. Right? Because again, in Jesus' day, having a meal was not like, hey, we're all going to go have Mexican food after service today. That's not, it was like a big deal. You only had meals with people you approved of and you accepted and you consider like, I'm putting my stamp of approval on them. And Jesus is constantly breaking down the fences that the Pharisees have put into place. So Jesus definitely encounters bounded set thinking, and he kind of pushes that aside. Does Jesus encounter fuzzy set thinking? Absolutely. In fact, the first followers of Jesus encountered this in a huge way. Because remember, they live in first century Rome. In first century Rome, you were allowed to worship whatever God you pleased. You could have any religion, go to any temple. They did not care, as long as you would confess that Caesar is Lord. Pay your taxes, submit to Caesar. So highly inclusive of whatever you want to do, as long as you submit to Caesar. Well, the first Christians would refuse to say Caesar is Lord because for them, only Jesus was Lord. And that's part of the reason why they get persecuted. They're actually, if you read the historical documents, Christians are oftentimes referred to as atheists because they will not worship Caesar. So we'd see Christians encounter fuzzy groups, they encounter bounded groups, but Jesus calls us to a different way, a third way, actually really a second way, that has nothing to do with lines whatsoever. This way is what Hiebert calls centered set thinking. So here's Jesus. All right, that's a cross, that's a circle to represent Jesus. For Jesus, he doesn't go around drawing lines. He also doesn't go around erasing lines, saying, what you're doing is not a big deal. What does Jesus constantly do? He invites people to follow him. And so inclusion in God's people and in his church is not based on boundaries, but it's based on the direction of your life. Are you moving towards Jesus or are you oriented away from him? All right, I drew too many circles, so just give me a second while I draw some arrows here. We got it. All right. So everywhere Jesus goes, he says, follow me. And the people who turn their life towards Jesus, they are in. The people, no matter how close they may be, if they are turned away from him, they are out. So for example, last week we talked about a guy named Zacchaeus. Do you remember that, or at least remember the story of Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Was he inside the boundaries or outside the boundaries that the Pharisees had set up? He was outside. So he's like very far away. But he has a meal with Jesus, and because of that meal, he turns his life towards Jesus. And as a result, he says, listen, I know I've defrauded a lot of people, so I'm going to pay everybody back plus interest. All right, so he was far away, but he turned towards Jesus. Interesting. Jesus did not tell this. He did not tell Zacchaeus, you do all that and then you follow me. He says, come follow me. And because of that, he gives everything away. He's turned towards Jesus. Meanwhile, we can contrast that with a guy named Judas. Do you remember Jesus' disciple Judas? Was Judas in close proximity to Jesus? Did he have a front row seat for miracles and teaching? And did he see people raised from the dead? Yes, he was close. But was he actually following Jesus? No, by the end, his heart had turned away. He may have been initially closer than Zacchaeus, but he was turned in the wrong direction. So what Jesus is actually calling us to do is to orient and center our lives completely on him. Now, to illustrate that, I'm not just making this up out of thin air, I want to walk through a very famous story in Scripture. It's found in Luke chapter 15. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Luke 15. And if you've grown up in church or you've maybe attended even one time in your entire life, you have heard this story before. It's commonly called the prodigal son, or in our case, we'll call it the story of the lost son. Now, if you're familiar with the story, there's actually two sons. There's a younger son and an older son. And first off, there's nothing I'm going to teach you about this story that you haven't heard a million times already. So let's lower the bar of expectation here. But here's what I want us to do. Oftentimes when we hear this story, we place ourselves in either the spot of the younger son or the older son. But today what I want us to do is to look at it from the perspective of the father. What does this story reveal about the character of the father? Does that make sense? All right, so we're going to dive in. Luke chapter 15, verse 1. All the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him. And the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Okay, let's pause here. Let's leave the verse up. Pop quiz, open notes, audience participation portion. Who has gathered to hear Jesus? Tax collectors and sinners. Who else? Pharisees and scribes. I love this. The Bible says, God is no respecter of persons. Listen, Jesus doesn't draw a line around the Pharisees and say, you guys are over there. Jesus has dinner at the Pharisees' house and at the prostitute's house. When Jesus is teaching, we see sinners and tax collectors show up and the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, the Pharisees and scribes, they may be skeptical and frustrated with Jesus, but I love there is still something so compelling about him. They cannot resist the fact to show up when he's teaching. So Jesus has shown up and there's people pointed in all different directions when he's teaching. And notice it says that the Pharisees and scribes are frustrated because Jesus is not abiding by their fences that they've put up. And so in order to combat this, Jesus tells 3 stories, and he's telling these stories particularly, so first the tax collectors and sinners would notice, but also he's trying to communicate a message to the Pharisees and scribes. So the first story he tells is the story of a shepherd who has 100 sheep. One of them goes missing. What does the shepherd do? Audience, guys, come on. I know we want hamburgers and hot dogs. If you don't answer, it takes longer to get to the hamburgers and hot dogs. He leaves the 99. He goes after the one. And when he finds the one, he gets everybody together and he throws a big party to celebrate because he found his lost sheep. All right, the next story he tells is a story of a woman who loses a coin. And so she flips up her whole house upside down. She finds the coin and she gets all of her friends together and throws a party to celebrate. So we have the story of the lost sheep, the story of the lost coin, and then we're going to get to the story of the lost son. So that's where we're going to jump in, Luke chapter 15, verse 11. He also said, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So he distributed the assets to them. All right, so pause for just a moment. Jesus, first century Jewish rabbi, speaking to first century Jewish people. It is a safe assumption that the characters in his story, although fictional, would have been assumed to be first century Jewish people. Now, I can only imagine if one of my kids came up to me and said, Dad, I'm tired of waiting for you to die. I just need my inheritance right now, right? Like I might be getting their inheritance. Like that's the whole conversation not going to go well. But especially in a first century Jewish culture, every household operates honor and shame. And for a son to come to the father and say, I'm ready for you to die, go ahead and give me the inheritance, would have brought shame on the family. Their social status would have been lowered. So the expectation would have been that this father would say, how dare you ask me that? Get out of here. But that's not what the father does. What does the father do? He goes ahead and gives him the inheritance. So already we're like questioning, like, does this guy know what good parenting is? That's not what a good parent does. And I do think it speaks to the character of God. Have you ever asked God for something and he gave you exactly what you asked for only to find out that that's not actually what you needed? Whether it was a house, whether it was a job, a relationship, you got what you asked for and it turns out, wait, maybe I don't have the best wisdom in the world. Well, this son goes ahead, he gets his inheritance. So let's pick back up verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food, and here I am dying of hunger? I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers. So he got up and went to his father. And let's stop there in the middle of verse 20. So what happens? This son gets his inheritance, and he goes off to a foreign land. Now, again, first century Jewish context, this implies that he goes off to a Gentile land, to non-Jewish people, and he squanders all of his inheritance. This is a big deal because in the Jewish community, if you took your inheritance or any kind of money and you lost it, you're only allowed to lose it to other Jewish people because there are commands in the Old Testament that every few years land would be returned, debt would be forgiven. It's so that all of God's resources stay within God's family. But if you lose them to a Gentile, you have lost God's stuff forever. This is a huge no. Like you would get banished from the community if you ever lost stuff to a Gentile. So here this guy's gone. He's lost everything to a Gentile land, to Gentile people. He gets hired to work with pigs. Again, first century Jewish context. Pigs are unclean. You never got near a pig. Not only is he working with pigs, he is so hungry he wants to eat what the pigs are eating. And then he thinks to himself, you know what? My dad has hired servants who get fed better than this. I should go back and ask my dad to hire me on. Which, by the way, absolutely ridiculous take. Okay, so let's think about this. First, this young man has brought shame upon his family by taking his inheritance early. He has brought shame on his community by losing all his stuff to Gentiles, and he's brought shame upon himself by working with pigs. And he has the audacity to think that his dad is going to welcome him back, which again, what does this reveal about the character of the father? That this son knew that whatever happens, that there was a chance that his father would welcome him back. And so he says, you know what? I'm going to get my stuff together. I'm going to tell him I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned in your sight. Like, I'm going to throw myself at his mercy. And he begins to walk back home. And I can only imagine what thoughts and feelings are going through this young son's mind. I don't know if this ever happened to you, but for me, there have been more times than I wish I could admit that I have had to make a phone call and deliver bad news, like something I did wrong. Or I had to sit down in front of a boss and own up to a mistake I made. This ever happened to anybody before? Like for me, I get this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach because I am just like, listen, I screwed up. I'm relying on your mercy. So I don't know if he feels sick. I don't know if he's running through his speech in his head. What's he going to say? But he's making his way back to his house. That's where we're going to pick back up second half of verse 20. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father told his servants, quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it, and let's celebrate with a feast. Because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. So this son walking home. All sorts of feelings, questions, fears. It says while he was a long way off, his father saw him. So if the father saw him while he was a long way off, what does that imply about the father? That he was looking for his son. He was waiting in anticipation. And what does the father do? He was so filled with compassion that he ran towards his son. Now again, honor shame culture. Adults don't run for first century Jewish people. I don't know if you ever had this experience. To me, when I was a kid, like the funniest thing in the world was when an adult like took off in a full-on like reckless sprint. I don't know, because like adults don't do that. I remember growing up, we lived in an apartment complex, and there's this big field outside our backyard, and so we would hang out in the backyard and sometimes venture into the field, but we really weren't supposed to go in there, and so a bunch of us kids are playing. And again, this was like a long time ago, so maybe my memory's a little fuzzy, but there was a toddler who lived next door. He was in a diaper, and he like takes off in this field, and he had to be like 50 yards away. And I remember turning to his mom and saying, I think your son is running away from home. And she like takes off full on like Phoebe from Friends kind of run, you know, like it's like some of you run for fun or for health, and you're weird. I don't get it, but I'll pray for you. But when adults run, even at that, like you kind of run prim and proper. No, this is like reckless, like you don't care. You have to get your kid. This man in first century Jewish culture should not be running. That would bring shame on him because only kids run like that, but he sees his son and he can't help himself. He actually brings shame on himself. Why is this important? Because remember, he has lost everything to Gentiles, the younger son. And if someone lost stuff to Gentiles and they returned back to the community, there was a ceremony called the Kaveva. And in the Kaveva, what they would do is they would banish you from the community. It would start by taking a large piece of pottery and throwing it on the ground because you've broken God's family. This is what you have done. And then the entire community would surround them and say, you're banished, you're ashamed, like get out of here. They would turn their backs and they would banish the person from the community. They would throw shame and banish. And so again, this is Matt Spear here. So I'm just thinking, as he's coming home, he's expecting the community there, ready to throw shame on him, to banish him. But before they can throw shame, the father invites shame on himself. He brings the shame on him so they will leave his son alone, and he wraps his arms around him. I love it, like the son like starts rehearsing his speech, like going through his speech, and before he can get through it, the father interrupts him, hugs him, puts a robe, sandals, ring. We could talk about that. We don't have time. And he kills the fattened calf. They throw a big party, and they celebrate because his son was dead, but now he's alive. He was lost, but now he's found. Now remember where we are in Luke 15. The tax collectors, the sinners, the Pharisees and scribes, they're listening. Jesus tells a story of a shepherd who loses a sheep, goes and finds it, throws a big party to celebrate. A woman who loses a coin, flips over her whole house, finds it, celebrates. Now this man, he has a son who's lost, he's been found, and they celebrate. End of story, right? No. Jesus adds an epilogue to this story. That's where we'll pick back up, verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he summoned one of the servants, questioning what these things meant. Your brother is here, he told him, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and didn't want to go in. So his father came out and pleaded with him. But he replied to his father, Look, I have been slaving many years for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him. Son, he told him, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So his older brother is out in the field working. Now, safe to assume, the brothers are supposed to be working the father's land together. When the younger son left, do you think that increased or decreased his older brother's workload? It increased. All right? Now, do you ever have people in your life, they go and they do the wrong thing and you're left holding the bag? They make bad decisions and it's impacted you. So I don't know how long he's been gone, but this guy's out in the field. He's picking up for his brother. By the time he comes back, there's a party going on at the house. So he grabs one of the servants and said, what's going on? He said, oh, your brother, he's back. And so your dad threw him this big party. And what does the son do? It says he became angry and he refused to go in. Now at this point, where is the father in the story? He's in the house. He's at the party. There's this beautiful symmetry. Before, the father was at the house and he ran to his lost son. Here he's in the house and he goes out to be with his other lost son. It's actually the story of two lost sons. One was lost because he went off and he went out of bounds. The other was lost because he had drawn the boundaries and no one else would respect them. And he's refusing to go in, and the father goes out and begs and pleads with him, come in. We have to celebrate because your brother was dead and now he's alive. He was lost and now he's found. And then the story ends. Like, it ends on a cliffhanger. Like, it doesn't end with the older brother being like, you're right, Dad, I'm such a butthead. I'm going to come in here and celebrate. It ends with a choice to be made. So remember, this story is being told in front of the tax collectors and the sinners. In the story, they are the younger son who left, the Pharisees and the scribes. They're the older son, frustrated because those people are outside the boundaries and now they're being celebrated and welcomed in. And what does Jesus call both of them to do? By the way, Jesus is the Father in the story. What does Jesus ask them to do? Set aside your boundaries. Come and follow me. The story is about the Father being at the center. And he's welcoming both sons in whenever they are ready to reorient them to Jesus. The younger son oriented to Jesus. The older son oriented away. So the question we're all supposed to wrestle with is, which way will I orient my life? All of that is just set up for what we're going to talk about next week. So thank you for being here for part one. But I do want to give you just a couple practical things. Because for me, I'm thinking, okay, what does this mean? Like, cool pictures, cool story. What does it actually mean for how I'm going to live my life tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day? The first thing, if we are going to have a Jesus-centered community, a Jesus-centered church, the first thing we have to do is define the center. All right, that's what we're doing all next week. We're defining the center. Because have you ever met somebody and it seems like they follow a different Jesus than you do? Anybody here ever seen Talladega Nights? Anybody afraid to raise their hands and admit? Because I'm pretty sure some people have seen this movie before. If you don't know, it's about a race car driver. And near the beginning of the movie, his whole family's sitting around the dinner table and he starts his prayer, dear 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus. His father-in-law gets mad. He's like, Jesus isn't a baby, he's a man. And his friend says, I like to think of Jesus wearing a tuxedo t-shirt on the front row of a Lynyrd Skynyrd concert. And of course, it's funny, but don't we all kind of do this? See, we're supposed to be made in God's image, but oftentimes we make God into our own image. And so there's certain parts of Jesus we like, and we'll follow those parts. But the parts that make us uncomfortable, we push those to the side. So it's extremely important. Somebody's trying to find somebody. That's the Find My iPhone alert. I know that one because I get pinged sometimes. So we have to define the center. Like, notice, this is not fuzzy set thinking. Notice in the story that the dad didn't say, you know what, to the younger son, you know what, it wasn't that big of a deal. Just come home whenever you're ready. He said, no, you were dead, and now you're alive. He doesn't tell the older son, he's like, you know what, just hang out there whenever you're ready. No, he goes and pursues. He's calling them to account, but we cannot have accountability if we don't know what we're being held accountable to. We have to define the center. Like, if I say, hey, everybody, we're going to go over to Dupree Park later, we're going to play soccer. And we get together, we're playing a soccer game, and in the middle of the game, somebody picks up the ball. Now, I don't know if you know soccer. You're not supposed to pick up the ball with your hands. So let's say somebody just picks it up and just starts running with it. Are we just going to say, oh, it's okay? No. We're all going to stop the game and say, that is not how you play soccer. Here's how you play. And if you don't want to play soccer, that's fine. But we're playing soccer here, so we want to invite everyone's welcome to play. But if you're going to play, you got to play by the rules. I think what Jesus said, everyone is welcome to follow, but you have to follow on his terms. We have to define the center. That's all next week. Second thing, we have to orient ourselves. Right? Before we can have a Jesus-centered community, we have to be Jesus-centered people. We have to spend time turning ourselves towards Jesus. And by the way, I don't know how it is for you. For me, this is a daily decision. Because some days I wake up and I'm here, and some days I wake up and I'm here, and some days I wake up, I'm here, and I'm there. Like, have you ever had a moment like you're in the middle of an argument, and you know you should just stop because it's not going to be productive, and then you say the thing you know you shouldn't say just because it would make you feel good in that moment? I'm not saying I've had those moments recently, but I have had those moments recently. And in those moments, I'm oriented away from Jesus. So every day I've got to turn myself back to him. That's why spiritual practices are so important. Like prayer, scripture reading, fasting, Sabbath, silence and solitude, worship, generosity. Those are all, they're tools in your toolkit. They help you orient yourself to Jesus. The goal isn't just to be a really good Bible reader. The goal is to become more like Jesus. The goal isn't to be really good at praying. It's to make sure we're oriented towards Jesus. And they're all like different exercises. If you ever go to the gym, there's different exercises, do different things. So when you bench press, you're building your chest. When you squat, it's lower body. If you want to get you want to scope the guns, you're going to do some curls, right? Like they all operate. So if you have a certain muscle group you want to target, you use certain exercises. In the same way, maybe you feel like consumerism has a grip on your life, then maybe for you the practice is generosity because it helps remind you to be a generous person. Maybe you have trouble hearing God because the noise of this world seems deafening. Maybe you need to implement silence and solitude. Maybe you feel disconnected from God. And so maybe prayer is something you begin to implement to strengthen the intimacy of that relationship. There are tools in your tool belt, and all of them help you orient yourself towards Jesus. And then the last thing is, as a church community, we have to fight for relationship. Because can I just tell you, this is messy. This is hard. Because there are going to be some people who follow Jesus and have the completely wrong worldview. There are going to be some people who take steps to follow Jesus and they vote for different people. There's going to be some people who follow Jesus and they're going to manage their money in ways we don't think they should. They're going to parent in ways we don't think they should parent. We're going to have a lot of disagreement. But the one thing we have in common is we are all journeying towards Jesus together. It is frustrating, it is messy, and there will be conflict. In fact, every single one of Paul's letters in the New Testament is written because people were trying to do this and then they got on each other's nerves and there was conflict and fallout, and Paul has to remind them to put Jesus at the center. In fact, after we finish this series, we're going to spend the rest of the year going through Galatians because you guys loved the Sermon on the Mount so much, we're just going to go through another book of the Bible. And in that, you know what Galatians is all about? It's all about this. The church is fracturing because it's hard to put Jesus at the center, and all Paul's doing is reminding, put Jesus at the center. And so it means that we have to be willing to have grace for one another, forgiveness. It means knowing that there's going to be all sorts of different types of people around us. But when the church comes together like this, it's a testament to the power of Jesus because there is unity even though there's not uniformity. What we have in common is greater than the things that tear us apart. In fact, for the very first Christian, hold on, before I do that, I don't have time for questions, but I'm going to do questions anyway. So if you have a question, you can ask one. They have to be quick. They have to be clear. They have to be relevant to what we're talking about. So did we get a text-in question? All right, how do we treat the people who are turned away from the center? Great question. I would say, how would Jesus treat the people who turned away from the center? Right? There are certain times we have to put boundaries in place. Like again, boundaries are healthy. They are helpful. This is not about setting up boundaries. But what did the father in the story do? Did he give up on either one of his sons? Did he pursue relationship? Did he hold them accountable? Yeah, like there are times where we need people in our lives who are going to push us to do the thing we should do even though we don't want to do it, right? That this is how it's helpful. But then there are some times where we have to be willing to let people go off to a foreign land because they're going to have to hit rock bottom before they come to their senses. And so there's not just one set answer, but here's what I would say. Never did Jesus just write people off. He always invited them back. We got to be people who, no matter how far away somebody is, that we just continue to invite them back to Jesus. And by the way, inviting them to Jesus, did I say the thing about evangelism yet? No, okay. I got confused between first and second service. This is huge to me. I got to get my pen again. Okay, so in bounded set thinking, the goal of evangelism is to get people to cross this line, right? Like it's unsuccessful if they didn't pray the prayer, raise their hand, anything else. But that's not the way Jesus approaches it. In every interaction, here's successful evangelism when we're able to help people take one turn towards Jesus. They might still be way out here, but if they've gone from this to this, that's successful. In our relationships with people, our job is not to convince, argue, to get people in the line. It's to continue to point them back towards Jesus. That's why I love the Blessed Rhythms, because as we pray for people and listen to them and eat with them and serve them and share God's story, these are all ways we can help reorient them to the center. Thank you so much. Whoever texted in that question, that's great, because I was going to forget this whole part that I wanted to say. All right, so here's what I want to do. For the first Christians, when they had communion, it wasn't lame crackers and juice like we're going to have in just a minute. You know what it was? It was a meal. Which, by the way, we're going to have a meal, hamburgers and hot dogs in just a minute. But the idea is that in that culture, again, honor, shame, slaves would never eat with masters. Men and women wouldn't eat together. Jews and Gentiles wouldn't eat together. They all ate separate. Where's the only place that all those people would come together? It was a meal, the communion meal, celebrating Jesus. And so in just a minute, we're going to have, and I shouldn't call it the lame crackers and juice. I just mean in respect to a full meal. In just a minute, we are going to have communion like we do every week with the crackers and the juice. And what I want you to do in that time is to take a moment to orient yourself towards Jesus. And so maybe it's sitting in prayer. Maybe it's rereading Luke 15. Maybe it's sitting in silence. But take a few minutes to orient yourselves to Jesus. And then when we go out there, and we have a good football Sunday communion meal, talk to people, get to know one another. I know we all want to talk to our friends. Get to know the people who are different, the people you don't know yet. Because it's actually when we build those relationships with people who are all over, that's when we bear witness to the world the power of Jesus' death and resurrection. So all across this room, would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're just so thankful. We're thankful that you didn't come and draw lines. Thank you that you didn't come to cast us out, but that you came and invited us to follow you. And so I pray right now for each and every person, maybe the people who feel like the lost son who are far away, that their hearts would begin to turn towards you. And I pray for those of us who are like that older son, who get frustrated, hurt, and wounded, that today you would help us to turn and to come inside to celebrate. Because Jesus, we just want to be more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.